Let's look at why some people do not vote. Negative campaigning is one reason why some people do not vote, but political scientists have proposed several others. Lack of civic engagement on the part of voters underlies many of these ideas. Other reasons have to do with the nature of campaigns and the structure of elections. Some voters do not vote because they do not participate in civic affairs, either locally or at the national level. Many of these non-voters lack efficacy. They do not believe that the government listens to people like them or that their vote actually matters in determining the outcome of elections and the business of government. Scholars have determined that individuals who lack efficacy exist across the social and economic spectrums, but that poorer people are more likely than better off individuals to feel that the government does not listen to people like them. Yet, although it is a common notion that people are alienated from politics or think that the government does not listen to their concerns, a recent study estimated that only about 9% of the U.S. population feels that way. This same survey indicated that people lacking efficacy, a group that the study called the disaffecteds, typically had a low level of educational attainment and were less likely to follow current events than more engaged citizens. Another explanation for why some Americans do not vote stems from the nature of political campaigns. In the United States, campaigns tend to be a long, drawn-out affair. For example, presidential campaigns typically last for more than a year, with some candidates positioning themselves 3 or 4 years in advance of an election. Contrast that with the many parliamentary systems, including Germany's, in which an election must be held within 60 days of the dissolution of parliament because of a no-confidence vote of the chancellor, similar to prime minister. Some scholars say that the lengthiness of campaigns leads to voter fatigue, the condition in which voters simply grow tired of all candidates by the time election day arrives, and may thus be less likely to vote. American journalist and humorist Franklin Adams commented that elections are won by men and women chiefly because most people vote against somebody rather than for somebody. The prevalence of negative campaigning compounds the phenomenon of voter fatigue. Even the most enthusiastic supporters of a candidate may feel their advocacy withering under the unceasing mudslinging that occurs in many high-level campaigns. And so, although evidence shows that negative advertising is effective in swaying voters' opinions, sometimes such advertising also succeeds in suppressing voter turnout by making voters less enthusiastic about voting. Political scientists also cite the structure of U.S. elections as a reason why more Americans do not vote. For years, voting rights activists claimed that the registration requirements in many states were too complicated and discouraged people from voting by making it too difficult to register. In 1993, Congress sought to remedy that situation by passing the National Voter Registration Act, frequently called the Motor Voter Act, which allows eligible people to register to vote when they apply for a driver's license or enroll in a public assistance program, or when they submit the necessary information by mail. Although there was an enormous anticipation that the motor voter law would significantly boost voter registration and turnout, in fact, its impact has been negligible. Critics of the structure of elections also point to their frequency. In the United States, the number of elections varies from municipality to municipality, and local government charters may call for more than 4 elections for municipal offices alone. Although most federal offices require only 2 elections, a primary and a general, these elections are not always held in conjunction with state, county, and municipal elections. The timing of elections also affects voter participation. Most general elections are held on a weekday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Moreover, although states decide when to hold primary elections, state legislative elections, and municipal and school board elections, these elections, too, typically occur on a weekday. Critics say that holding elections on weekdays or over a 2-period day instead, or establishing a national voting holiday, would increase voter turnout by ensuring that voters had ample opportunity to cast their ballots. A final explanation as to why some people do not vote is that they make a conscious choice that not voting is a rational, logical action. Called the rational abstention thesis, this theory states that some individuals decide that the costs of voting, in terms of time, energy, and inconvenience required to register to vote, to become informed about candidates and elections, and actually to vote, are not worth the effort when compared to the expected benefits, or what the voter could derive from voting. In light of these cumulative costs, it is perhaps surprising that so many people choose to vote. One explanation for why they do is that most voters report that they derive physiological or psychological rewards from exercising this citizen's right, feelings of being civically engaged, satisfied, and patriotic. But when the costs associated with voting increase too much, turnout drops. More people choose not to vote when voting becomes too inconvenient. This drop-off occurs, for example, when municipalities shorten voting hours and during inclement weather. From a civic engagement perspective, non-voting is both a symptom and a result of a lack of civic involvement on the part of individuals. Your roommate might not vote because she is not civically engaged, because she feels that she has little to contribute and that the government does not listen to people like her anyway. But by not voting, she perpetuates this lack of efficacy by remaining outside the process rather than staking a claim to what is rightfully hers. The idea that every individual has the right to a voice in the composition and priorities of the government. Only by becoming civically engaged, learning about the candidates, discussing issues, and voting, can she break the cycle of inefficacy. Voting will make her pay more attention to campaigns, candidates, and issues. Beyond the effects of non-voting on individuals, low voter turnout affects the polity. When relatively few people vote in a given election, the outcome is likely to represent the will of only that subset of the electorate who voted. Consider that the polls indicate that the outcomes of the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections would have been different if voter turnout had been higher. In each of these elections, the Democratic nominee, Al Gore and John Kerry respectively, was the favored candidate among several groups whose voter turnout falls below average, including voters aged 24, African American voters, and voters with low incomes. The process becomes cyclical. These non-voters who disagree with the outcome conclude that the government does not represent them, feel less efficacious, and are less inclined to vote in the future. Moreover, some scholars assert that democracies with low voter turnout are more likely to generate threats to their own well-being. In democracies with low voter turnout, these scholars say, charismatic, popular political figures may rise to power and become authoritarian leaders. Corruption, too, can be a problem in low voter turnout democracies where government officials might feel relatively unconcerned about the disapproval of disgruntled constituents. Other researchers, however, contend that not voting is not a big problem, especially in cases where large numbers in the electorate are relatively uninformed about candidates and issues. A number of scholars in this camp argue that participation by the uninformed is undesirable because it may lead to drastic changes in government. Opponents of this view counter that because of political parties' role in selecting candidates, the menu for voter choice is actually quite limited in most elections. Role in selecting candidates. The menu for voter choices, Those who argue that non-voting does not matter also ignore the fact that voting tends to produce more engaged citizens who, because they vote, feel a duty to be informed and involved. Other scholars who claim that low voter turnout is not a problem argue that low voting rates are simply a function of people's satisfaction with the status quo. Their non-voting simply means that they do not seek a change in government. This argument, however, does not explain why low voter turnout is most likely to occur in populations that are least likely to be satisfied with their situation. For example, people with lower incomes are much less likely to vote than those with higher incomes. Whatever the reason, a lack of efficacy is argued by some, satisfaction is argued by others. Non-voters' best chances of having their views reflected in the policy process is to articulate them through voting.